precursor to the modern novel and a landmark in the genre of European travel literature, a 1510 itinerary written in the first person by the Bolognese adventurer Ludovico de Varthema became a bestseller in the 16th century, with translations into Europe's major languages by the next. Its vivid first-person account of journeys from the Levant through Arabia, India, and as far as the Spice Islands offered readers a seductive blend of geography, ethnography, and wonder, and it imprinted itself deeply on later European travel writing. Varthema's text and the later woodcuts and prints that accompanied its German translations after 1515 profoundly directed German and European visual ethnography through the modern period, where depictions of foreign peoples crystallized into recognizable racial types and biased imagery of Indian ritual enjoyed long afterlives in Northern European visual culture. Further, Orientalism and sexuality in Varthema's chapters on India have been persuasively linked to the project of European hegemony in the Itinerary's scholarship, and more recently this proto-Orientalism has been turned through the lens of Italian humanism in further analysis of the same Indian chapters. While Varthema's contribution to early modern ideas of the other and the structures of colonialism have been articulated, the Itinerary's parallel legacy in structures of racism, particularly its gendered and sexualized forms, that have endured through the modern era, has thus far remained outside of the purview of its scholarship. To understand that legacy, this paper invokes the work of Geraldine Heng, who argued that any assumption of race as a modern construct bred by Enlightenment-era pseudoscience is undermined by the considerable evidence for racial thinking in the medieval lexicon and more recent works which further detail the many manifestations of medieval visual culture's active participation in the European race-making project. In this context, markers such as skin colour, clothing, religion, and geographic origin determined social hierarchies and imaginative geographies long before the transatlantic slave trade codified a rigid biological racism. This paper builds upon recent studies informed by pre-modern critical race theory erected around the visual archive of San Marco in Venice, whose mosaics, sculpture, and sacred imagery furnish a highly visible medieval template for representing the other. Images, like those of San Marco, did not illustrate mere somatic difference, but actively constructed and circulated racial meaning. By the time of their creation, humanist discourse also contributed to the perception and production of race by emphasizing Venice's Trojan and Roman descent, as it advocated for a restoration of a universal Roman Empire, in a new Christian form in Trecento visual culture. From this intellectual context as historical backdrop, the racial and ethnic constructs of Varthema's Itinerary 2 centuries later are nevertheless grounded in these, and still older Christian, ethnic typologies defined by an entrenched Crusades-era logic of the Moor or Saracen as other and enemy. The transmission of classical knowledge too, with its notions about geography and climate, as well as nascent ideas of race in Hellenistic works like Ptolemy's Almagest, are further sources to the larger picture of pre-modern Orientalism that is observable in the writings of Petrarch that circulated from the 14th century onwards. Varthema's text will be framed in this paper as a conduit through which the moral and visual lexicon of medieval race-making entered early modern ethnography, tracing how the representational systems embedded in San Marco's imagery were reanimated in Varthema's prose. Focusing on the rarely studied chapters set in Arabia Felix, Yemen, itself a marginalized area within studies of European global expansion, rather than the oft-cited Indian episodes, their descriptions of captivity, encounter, and desire in South Arabia are informed by these medieval hierarchies. Set against the final decade of the Tahirid Sultanate in early 16th century Lower Yemen, his narrative transposes moralized structures of difference into the sensational idiom of Renaissance travel literature. Varthema's Itinerary constitutes an especially valuable text for considering the continuities of racial thought across the problematic construct of a rigid medieval/early modern divide. The strict distinctions of that divide are further eroded when it is remembered that the Itinerary's author emerged from a milieu where the quintessentially late medieval worldview coexisted with the emerging characteristics of the Renaissance and early modern period. Varthema was born in Bologna in the 1470s, a time in which enslaved black Africans and Muslims were already part of the social fabric in Florence and other Italian centres. Their presence owed to the Mediterranean slave trade, which made somatic and religious differences of the other a marker of low social status and vulnerability among the Latin Christian, for our purposes, white normativity of medieval Italian culture. While direct knowledge of enslaved Africans doubtlessly coloured the itinerary, this paper focuses on how Varthema's travelogue furthered racializing tropes and stereotypes present in influential medieval texts and the monumental visual programmes he would have seen in Venice, the first leg of his long journey. Venice by the late 15th century offered a panoply of monumental public images of foreignness, race and religious difference. For Varthema and many others, Venice was Europe's portal to the East, with the maritime route to Alexandria a major connection to the Islamic Mediterranean. The Venice-Alexandria link was integral to the Venetian sense of civic and religious identity, ritual and art, as it all hinged upon the translation of St. Mark's relics from Egypt. This 9th century theft of the saints' remains were notoriously, if apocryphally, carried out under the noses of Muslim guards, who did not notice the holy contraband hidden under a cargo of pork. Public-facing religious artwork in Venice celebrated the story of the translatio, as well as the Evangelist's Egyptian mission and the conversion of Saracens during his lifetime. These images transmogrified the port of Alexandria in the Venetian and European imagination from mere trading destination to a lodestar on the medieval symbolic landscape of Christian triumph over all others. On his departure along this storied and sacralized route, Varthema would not have been oblivious to the civic-religious significance of Venice's patron saint and evangelist, as well as the racial hierarchies embedded in its monumental visual hagiographies that adorn the walls and domes at the Basilica San Marco, then as now a major landmark and all but compulsory destination for visitors to La Serenissima. Thomas Dale's studies demonstrate how monumental sculpture and mosaics within San Marco establish a racializing hierarchy of others. Saracens, itself a charged term given to Mediterranean and Arabic Muslims in the medieval era, are marked by their turbans and costume, which functioned as their predominant visual identifiers. Ethiopians and black Africans are canonically depicted, by contrast, with the biological markers of dark skin and tightly curled hair. Sculpted lions and griffins at the Porta da Mar, the south portal leading to the Piazzetta of San Marco, clutch-bound captives in their claws. The latter broods over an African, whose blackness is communicated not through the white stone of its medium, but through the detailed treatment of its dense curly hair and non-European facial features. In the western dome of the nave, the Pentecost mosaic of San Marco, circa 1100 to 1150, is an early essay on the medieval period's classification of racial differences. In the supports of the dome's fenestrated drum are personifications of the various nations of the known world, identified by text in the mosaic, such as Arabs, Parthians, Elamites, etc. A pair of dark-skinned Egyptians in this cycle are read as embodiments of the desired conversion and redemption of Ham's African descendants within the Middle Ages dream of a universalizing Christian church. Further, the Pentecost's Egyptians have elsewhere been interpreted as a reflection of the enduring conceptions of African physiognomy, which advanced blackness as a racialized ethnographic identity parallel to its symbolism of universal Christian conversion. Some, though not all, of the Pentecost mosaics nations take the form of gendered couples, with a male and a female distinguishable by their different dress. This schematic convention of representation is, to my knowledge, the earliest visual precursor in a rare monumental form of the couples and costumes convention that defined early modern illustrated ethnographical handbooks. These images and the genre to which they contributed are credited for their principal role in the crystallization of rigid concepts of biological race and, by extension, racism through the modern era. The beginning of the couples and costumes convention is more conventionally pinpointed much later to Hans Burgkmayer's long woodcut frieze of 1508, Peoples of Africa and India, which was inspired by travel sketches of Balthasar Springer's voyage 3 years prior. The late 1520s Trachtenbuch of artist Christopher Weiditz depicted figures from the Iberian Peninsula in the paired format seen centuries earlier at San Marco and still current in contemporary works like the 1520 Omnium Gentium Mores, Leges, et Ritus, and the substantial body of colonial texts and imagery in the centuries to follow. The closest visual parallels to Varthema's route through Arabia and Asia appear in 2 anonymous 16th century illuminated manuscripts made in Goa by Indian artists for Portuguese patrons, the Codex Casanatense and the Codex Angelica. Both depict the peoples the Portuguese encountered as their maritime empire expanded from Africa to East Asia. Although the manuscripts are hard to date, the presence of a Japanese couple suggests that the Angelica was produced after the Casanatense. Their major difference concerns the representation and deafening absence of Arabia. The Casanatense includes merchants of the Hijaz, armed Bedouins, Fataki warriors, and women bathing at Muscat. By contrast, the Angelica shows only a royal couple from Hormuz. The absence of Aden, despite its importance as a port, hints at a deliberate exclusion and reflects Yemen's marginalization in Portuguese imperial thought after the Tahirid dynasty resisted their attempts to seize the region. These omissions reveal how ethnographic image-making reinforced territorial and racial hierarchies. By the mid-16th century, costume books widely codified differences of skin colour, dress and gender, translating medieval Christian ideas about universal order into the secular visual language of empire. In this light, Varthema's Itinerary becomes a literary counterpart to this long visual genealogy, first seen in the San Marco Pentecost mosaic. His text carries forward medieval ways of categorizing nations, faiths, and bodies into the ethnographic descriptions that shaped early modern racial imagination. Just as early modern manuscripts framed distant peoples through the lens of empire, medieval mosaics prefigured this ordering of the world, situating Saracens and Africans in relation to a Christian norm that shaped perception, identity, and the racial matrix. In San Marco, the Capella Zen mosaics depict the martyrdom of St. Mark in Alexandria. Turbaned Saracens restrain the saint with chains, while a darker African executioner delivers the fatal blow. This imagery structured a triadic racial schema, the Saracen as troubling but potentially assimilable, the Ethiopian more distant and threatening, and both defined against Christian whiteness and cultural normativity. For travellers departing Venice, these scenes staged an ideologically charged prelude to the wider world, placing populations beyond Europe within a rigid medieval hierarchy of complexion and faith, where lighter Saracens might achieve salvation, but African blackness was condemned to perdition. Denva Gallant shows how black African figures were mobilized rhetorically as both violent antagonists and objects of conversion, cast as spiritually deficient yet potentially redeemable. In either case, they reinforced Christian supremacy. Such imagery helped forge an emergent white Christian identity through contrast with Islamic and African alterities, embedding pre-modern racial logic in public, monumental sacred space. The visual and ideological framework erected at San Marco prefigures the ways early modern travellers would encounter and describe the wider world. With this context, we now turn from monumental visual representation to the narrative strategies and detailed observations of Varthema's Itinerary. The first chapter makes clear the narrator's desire to visit lands least frequented by the Venetians, bypassing Alexandria, which he calls well known to all, and continuing down the Nile to Cairo, which he also deems too familiar. He soon moves on to Beirut, Tripoli, Aleppo, Amman, and Damascus, described briefly with perfunctory notes on their size, resources, and occasional historic ruins, but little narrative development. In Damascus, however, Varthema provides extraordinary detail on the Mameluke soldiers. enslaved Caucasian men often sent to the Ottoman Empire as tribute from the Balkans, Georgia and Circassia. This detail becomes crucial in the next chapter, when Varthema assumes the clothes and identity of a Mameluke soldier, taking the name Yunus, to travel with a pilgrimage caravan to Mecca. Along the way, he fights a desert tribe, reaches Medina, and completes the rituals of the Hajj, a detailed account of the Muslim pilgrimage that marks a credible first in European travel literature. So far, Varthema's true identity is submerged in the text beneath his assumed Moorish persona, and only at Aden, where hostile officials expose him as a Latin, do the tropes of Saracen and Blackness fully emerge. His capture and imprisonment reflect the historical moment. Early 16th century Aden and the Red Sea were sites of Portuguese attempts to establish a colonial foothold, and survivors of these attacks call for Varthema's death. The capture and chaining of St. Mark in San Marco's mosaics reappear in Varthema's narrative, from his being put in irons on the second day, to the great violence of his transfer to the Vice-Sultan's palace, to 65 days of imprisonment with 18 pounds of iron on his feet. In Jörg Breu, the Younger's woodcut for the 1515 German translation, Varthema, visually identified by his traveller's hat and slouched boots, is flanked by two captors, while another prisoner follows behind. Their richly detailed garments with brocade, garters and conical turbans mark them as more à la Saracen. Others, well within the traditional lexicon of customs and costumes books and the Pentecost mosaic, meticulous attention to dress reinforces a materiality of race explored by Kaplan, Katz, Smith and Hall. Breu's depictions of the Muslim officials at Aden are light-skinned and composed, their contrapposto stance suggesting near courtly elegance. While still othered, they are neither grotesque nor irredeemable. Anchored in Varthema's text, Breu's woodcut carries the visual logic of medieval Christian art into the early modern period, reproducing a racialized hierarchy in which Arabs or Saracens occupy an intermediary space of civility and potential conversion. Notably, the trope of black barbarism is absent from both Breu's woodcut and Varthema's narrative at this junction. Varthema avoids immediate death in Aden because the unnamed sultan was absent, and no black figure threatens Varthema as he is transported in chains for 8 days to the inland capital of Rada'a. Blackness in a monstrous form appears in later chapters of the Itinerary, completing the racial triad of Christian whiteness and Saracen ambiguity that Dale charts in the 13th century, and doing so through figures already familiar to the medieval religious and literary imagination. In Rada'a, Varthema attracts the attention of the Sultan's wife. In his text, she is only the nameless queen, though historically the title sultana may be more accurate. Her monologues convey both desire and melancholy, emphasizing the contrast between her dark skin and Varthema's fair complexion. For 12 days, she pampers him with food, delicacies, slaves, and perfumed baths. She commands him to remove his shirt and studies his body for 2 hours, according to Varthema, before expressing her lament in direct speech.
O God, thou hast created this man white like the sun. Thou hast created my husband black, my son also is black, and I am black. Would to God that this man were my husband. Would to God that I might have a son like this man.
This striking moment with the Black Sultana underscores the ways Varthema's text enacts medieval racial and moral schemas. Her desire, wealth, and power invert European gender norms, while her dark skin contrasts with Varthema's fair complexion, visually and narratively completing the triad of Christian whiteness, Saracen ambiguity, and monstrous blackness. Across episodes in Aden and Rada'a, Varthema translates the hierarchical logic of San Marco's mosaics into text. Arabs occupy an intermediary, potentially convertible space, while blackness, here and in later chapters, appears as both morally and culturally marked. The Itinerary demonstrates how early modern European travel literature inherited and adapted medieval Christian ideas of race, gender, and virtue, showing that whiteness and the other were constructed across centuries through both visual and literary forms. Thank you.